Hello everyone, welcome to another one of our Odinist videos. Today we're going to be discussing Loki, who we are going to dub the god of gossip. For those of you who aren't familiar, we will be spending the majority of our time in the Eddas. This will be the greater Eddas of Snorri Sturluson in the section known as Loki's Wranglings, or Lokasinna. Loki is almost a figure that is famous in Norse mythology, largely due to the influence of Marvel Comics, as Thor himself. And while his nature as a trickster is well known, it's also assumed that he's a deceiver. And while at times this is true, it's not always the case. If someone with a reputation for lying tells the truth, that doesn't alter the truth. That just means you're less likely to trust it. You should judge it by higher standards. But what we're going to discuss isn't just the things that Loki said, or even necessarily the kind of being Loki is, but the implications in Odinism for calling this kind of character a god, an absolute moral standard for how you ought to live your life. When we clarify that as well, we're also going to examine some of the truthful claims that he made about the other gods of Odinism and the implications of having immoral gods. So starting with our first point, if Loki isn't even technically a god in Odinism, then we shouldn't treat him like it, correct? But the problem is we have two very good reasons to consider Loki, in fact, a god, on the terms that we would refer to any of the Norse deities as gods. First and foremost, in Lokasenna verse 9, the Eddas itself claims that he is. Loki speaking says, "Remember, Odin, in olden days that we both our blood have mixed." Some would say this is referring to their adoption, others in the cutting of hands and mingling that a blood pact was made. Either way, then didst thou promise no ale to pour unless it were brought for us both. Now, this is significant, but on top of the fact that he claims some sort of bargain, some joining and union between him and Odin, Odin himself also treats him like one of the Aesir. In verse 10, immediately following, "Stand forth then, Vithar, and let the wolf's father," this is a reference to Fenrir, "find a seat at our feast, lest evil should Loki speak aloud here within Aesir's hall," which he then went on to do. So he's welcomed among the Aesir, and reminds Odin that they are of the same blood. And again, this is a reference to his adoption, since his blood parents were the giants Svabruti and Laufi, I believe her name would be pronounced. And this is according to the commentary of Dr. Henry Adams Bellow. And he even reminds Odin of a promise that he wouldn't drink anything unless it was also provided for Loki as well. Now, this is either a statement expressing equality or at least the level of hospitality welcome to Loki in his hall, because as you remember in Gylfaginning, that Odin never eats, he only drinks wine. So Odin would rather starve himself than deny Loki a place within his halls. So, if this is the same respect you would give to any of the Aesir, if not more so, even to Thor, you couldn't deny that Loki was a god, or at least has this sort of position within Odinism, for the same reason that you couldn't deny that Thor was a god, or Frigg was a god, or Balder, or Tyr, or any of the Aesir. All of them are treated and called as gods by Odin himself. So you have to grant that fact, that Loki is in fact one of the Aesir. But moving on from that point, if he holds that sort of place within Odinism, what does Loki then claim with this status? What does he do with it? Well, we've titled this video The God of Gossip, and he has some very interesting comments to make about his fellow Aesir. He makes the accusation first of cowardice towards Bragi in verse 13 of Lokasenna, where he says, "In horses and rings thou shalt never be rich, Bragi, but both shalt thou lack. Of the gods and elves here together met least brave in battle, thou art," or art thou. And he also notes, "and shyest thou art of the shot." So on top of being clumsy, he calls him the least brave in battle. And among Norse culture, this was a hefty accusation to level especially at one of the Aesir. Moving on from cowardice, he also makes, let's see, 5 notes here today in my notes of infidelity among the Azir. First of Ithun, who was Bragi's wife, mentioned previously, in verse 17 of Lokasenna. Be silent, Ithun, thou art, I say of women, most lustful in love, since thou thy washed bright arms did wind about thy brother's slayer. So he makes the accusation that you have interacted with your brother's murderer carnally, which is strange no matter what way you slice it. Likewise, Frigg, who is Odin's wife, for those of you who don't remember, in verse 26 is accused of adultery. Be silent, Frigg, Loki speaking. Thou art Fjorgyn's wife, but ever lustful in love for Vili and Vi. These are Odin's brothers. Thou wife of Vithrir, both in thy bosom have lain. So, all that being said, Skathi, who is Njord's wife and the mother of Frigg and Freyr, by the way, in verse 52, Loki makes the accusation of adultery on their part. More lightly thou speakest with Laufey's son. This is reference to his blood father, or mother rather. When thou badst me come to thy bed, such things must be known, if now we two shall seek our sins to tell. So Loki says we had that sort of relationship at one time or another. An accusation is made towards Sif, who is Thor's wife, in verse 54, where it says, Alone thou wert, if truly thou wouldst all men so shyly shun. But one do I know full well, methinks, who had thee from Jordhi's arms. And it notes parenthetically, Loki crafty in lies. Now, we'll clarify that in a moment. This would be a false statement on Loki's part, but unfortunately it would be the first that he's spoken this evening. Then lastly, there was a reference in verse 28 of Lokasenna, so we'll take a few steps back, where Loki admits to fratricide. And note that this weighs on all the Azir very heavily, the incident involving Balder. Verse 28 of Lokasenna, Thou wilt then, Frigg, that further I tell of the ill that I now know. Mine is the blame, that Balder no more thou seest ride home to the hall. Now, we made the statement that Loki is known for being a trickster and as well a deceiver, but not always. The question is, which one of these statements, these 3 categories and this large number of 7 accusations on Loki's part, sharing the gossip among the gods, are in fact truthful? Well, starting with Bragi, he calls Loki a liar in verse 14, immediately following his accusation, and threatens to rip off his head for it. But when Loki challenges him further by calling him a pride of benches, which is another term for a bride, his wife has to come in and defend him, which doesn't make you look good when Bragi has to step in to defend you. A little bit of implications. We can't conclude one way or another, but let's continue. About Ithun, the accusation is never denied in the subsequent verse. She simply makes the clarification and wish that she doesn't want them to fight. About Frigg, instead of disputing the claim against her honor in sleeping with her brothers-in-law, she changed the topic to what would happen if Balder were there to defend her. Frigg's affair with both of Odin's brothers in his absence is also further confirmed in the prose Eddas Gylfaginning. About Skathi, we have no response, refutation, and note this, no confirmation of Loki's claim of having an affair with Skathi. So, after assuming one accusation of adultery on the part of Ithun, let's let this one slide as a lie on Loki's part. So we have 1 accusation of adultery, 2 in noting for Frigg, who is very high, 1 accusation of cowardice that perhaps might follow through given what the response was. He defended himself with words but couldn't back them up with deeds. Skathi, perhaps that isn't true. We're going to assume that's the case, so now Loki is a liar, which doesn't help in the case that we're trying to make here today. Sif, who is Thor's wife, the claim is refuted in the text itself as well as the commentaries of Norse scholars like Dr. Henry Adams Bellows, and this is confirmed as well. Sif never cheated on Loki, or on Thor rather, with Loki. On the other hand, however, she did cheat on Thor. We'll do other videos about that. Finally, about Loki himself, he isn't lying. about being responsible for Baldur's death. According to the Prose Eddas Bokilfagnin, section 49, he became a woman and asked Frigg the secret of Baldur's invulnerability, and discovered that the mistletoe was the one enchantment she wasn't able to protect Baldur from. And then he went to the blind Azir Hadr and told him, hey, don't you want to join in on throwing a bunch of stuff at Baldur and showing how invincible he is? And he says, I can't see him. How am I going to do that? And he says, oh, I'll guide you. Here's an arrow made of mistletoe. And shot the arrow, not knowing that it would end up killing Baldur. And so Loki says, that was my doing. I'm the one who introduced that mistletoe arrow into his arsenal. So, while Loki is among those, and note this as well, of all the accusations, some were truthful, some were not, but of all the 7 accusations that we mentioned, and we could make others, the majority of them, with the exception of 2, could be confirmed as true, and the ones that were false are marks still against the concept of an Azir in Norse mythology. The moral failings of Norse standards of honor in the bedroom as well as the battlefield are both very serious. They're where they matter most as far as Odin's religion and Norse culture are concerned. And since Loki is among those that fall short, the entirety of the Azir join him in this camp of hypocrisy. Now, why does all of this matter? Well, in conclusion, in making this final point, I want to point out 2 very important things. What you believe about God matters. Should an Odinist decide, of the many gods available for them to choose from, that Loki is his example, he is completely justified in modeling his character and his identity after Loki's moral authority. Your God is your good, as they say. An Odinist is completely then within their rights, both religiously and philosophically, to claim that the following are good things based on Loki's example, plainly from the verses we've read today. Slander, which could be taken for or against, it's what the majority of the internet consists of nowadays. False accusations of things, by the way, that could be death penalties in certain cultures, and especially those in the modern Odinist terms. Accessories to murder. Loki's participation in the incident with Baldur would vindicate someone in setting someone up to be killed, though in an indirect fashion. And finally, adultery themselves. So any civil court cases that would involve infidelity and the liquidation of marriage thereof would be completely irrelevant by someone saying, hey, this is my moral obligation to follow the example of my God. I form whether or not something is right or wrong based off of which God I choose to follow. And if that God is my definition of good, Loki's just as much a choice as Thor or Odin. And I wouldn't recommend the 2 of them either. But even then, if you don't take your religious views seriously, if you're that kind of individual, the kind of role models you look to matter for the same reasons. If the example is lifted up as champions, and in Loki's case, the ultimate victor in Odinism, then the only lesson you could take from that is a practical example of nice guys finish last. At Ragnarok, Loki is going to usher in the end of the world and succeed. His child, Fenrir, is going to murder Odin. The Dormonger, the world serpent, is going to kill Thor. Loki's going to definitely fall in Heimdall's blade, but what difference does it make if everything's going to ultimately die? He may be bound by the organs of his own children in the meantime, but in calling him a god, you have given him a place in your life and in your religion that no human being at any time in history should consider the foundation of their morality. If you want to discuss this further, the comment section will remain open so long as YouTube allows me to, but I want to thank you all for at least taking the time to examine this aspect of your religion. Again, remember that if you're going to make any objective decisions about your religious views, I cannot recommend Odinism, and I'm giving you reasons. But if you want to know more about Jesus Christ by contrast, I'd be more than honored to talk to you about it. Know that we're talking about these things because I care about you, and I don't want you to model these sorts of individuals, that I give you more credit in being able to think through your religion than most on the internet and even among your own circles would. But also note this as well. Why are we talking about this in the first place? Because your view of God matters. And I can't recommend the God of gossip, but I can recommend Jesus Christ.